The ghost of the armistice, November 11th, 1918. 5 o'clock in the morning. Inside a cold, damp railway carriage in the forest of Compiègne, France, the silence was heavy enough to crush a man's spirit. On one side of the table sat Marshal Ferdinand Foch, the commander of the Allied forces. On the other, a small group of exhausted German delegates. There were no handshakes. There was no polite conversation. Foch pushed a document across the table. It was not a request for peace. It was an ultimatum for total surrender. November 11th, 1918. 5:12 in the morning, the German delegates signed the papers. The terms were brutal. Germany was to surrender all its heavy weaponry, its fleet, and its dignity. But more importantly, it was to evacuate all occupied territories within 2 weeks. The war that had consumed the world for 4 years was ending not with a victory on the battlefield, but with a collapse of the home front. November 11th, 1918, 11 o'clock in the morning. Across the scarred landscape of the Western Front, the roar of artillery abruptly stopped. Men who had been trying to kill each other for 1,563 days suddenly stood up from the mud. In a trench near the Meuse River, Sergeant Carl Schmidt stared at the gray sky. He expected to feel joy, but he felt only a hollow, aching dread. He looked at his soldiers, hungry, lice-ridden, and broken. They were not a defeated army in their own eyes. They were still standing on French soil. This was the birth of a lie that would kill millions. As the German troops began the long march back to their homeland, the myth of the stab in the back began to spread like a virus. The soldiers believed they had been winning, only to be betrayed by the November criminals, the socialists, the Jews, and the politicians in Berlin. This resentment was the first brick laid in the foundation of the Second World War, the Mirrors of Vengeance. January 18th, 1919, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The Paris Peace Conference opened in the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles. The location was a deliberate insult. This was the same room where the German Empire had been proclaimed in 1871. Now, the leaders of the Big Three, the United States, Great Britain, and France, gathered to decide the fate of the world. President Woodrow Wilson arrived with a dream of a League of Nations. He wanted a peace without victory. But Georges Clemenceau, the Prime Minister of France, had seen his country bled dry. He wanted Germany crushed so thoroughly that it could never rise again. June 28, 1919, 3:12 p.m. The German delegates were led into the Hall of Mirrors. They were not allowed to negotiate. They were handed a pen and told to sign. The Treaty of Versailles was a document of pure retribution. Under Article 231, the War Guilt Clause, Germany was forced to accept total moral responsibility for the war. The financial penalty was staggering, 132 billion gold marks in reparations. Germany lost 13% of its territory. Its coal mines in the Saar were handed to France. Its military was limited to a mere 100,000 men, hardly enough to keep order at home, let alone defend a nation. Most fatefully, the Polish Corridor was created, cutting Germany in half to give the new nation of Poland access to the sea. When the news reached Berlin, the people were in shock. They had expected a peace based on Wilson's 14 points. Instead, they received a death sentence. In the back of a crowded cafe, a young, bitter veteran named Adolf Hitler stared at the newspaper with tears of rage in his eyes. He didn't see a treaty. He saw a declaration of a new war, the Red Winter and the death of the Mark, January 5th, 1919. 9 o'clock in the evening. Berlin was no longer a city of culture. It was a war zone. The Spartacist uprising had begun. Communist revolutionaries, inspired by the Bolsheviks in Russia, seized the offices of the major newspapers. They wanted a Soviet Germany. January 15th. 1919, 11:30 at night. The revolutionary leaders Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht were captured by the Freikorps paramilitary units of right-wing veterans. They were beaten, shot, and their bodies were dumped into the icy waters of the Landwehr Canal. The new Weimar Republic had survived its first crisis, but it had done so by relying on the very men who hated democracy. The seeds of fascism were being watered with the blood of the left. January 11th, 1923, 8:45 in the morning. French and Belgian troops marched into the Ruhr, the industrial heart of Germany. Germany had fallen behind on its coal deliveries for reparations, and France decided to take it by force. The German government responded with passive resistance. They told the workers to stop. To pay them, the government did the unthinkable. They turned on the printing presses 24 hours a day. November 15th, 1923, 10 o'clock in the morning. Carl Schmitt walked into a grocery store in Berlin. He carried a suitcase filled with 1 trillion marks. By the time he reached the front of the line, that money wasn't enough to buy a single egg. This was hyperinflation, the total annihilation of the German middle class. People burned money in their stoves because it was cheaper than wood. They papered their walls with banknotes. But the real damage was psychological. If you had saved your whole life, you were now a beggar. If you were a gambler or a debtor, you were rich. The moral compass of the nation was shattered. The people didn't want liberty anymore. They wanted bread and order. The beer hall shadow. November 8th, 1923, 8:45 in the evening. While the country drowned in inflation, Adolf Hitler decided it was time to strike. He burst into the Burger Brokeler, a massive beer hall in Munich, followed by his armed brownshirts. He fired a shot into the ceiling and declared that the national revolution had begun. November 9th, 1923, 12:30 p.m. Hitler's march through the streets of Munich ended in a hail of police bullets at the Feldherrnhalle. 16 of his followers were killed. Hitler fled, but he was captured 2 days later. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison, but he served only 9 months. In his comfortable cell at Landsberg prison, Hitler didn't reflect on his failures. Instead, he wrote. He dictated a book titled Mein Kampf, My Struggle. In its pages, he laid out a blueprint for the destruction of the Jewish people and the conquest of the Soviet Union. He realized that to destroy the Republic, he couldn't use a coup. He had to use the ballot box. He would use democracy to kill democracy. The Golden Illusion. August 30th, 1924, 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The German government signed the Dawes Plan. This was a massive financial lifeline from the United States. American bankers began to flood Germany with loans to help pay reparations and stabilize the economy. For the first time since the war ended, it seemed as if the storm clouds were parting. The Golden Twenties had begun, but they were built on a foundation of borrowed time and foreign gold. October 29th, 1925, 8 o'clock in the evening. Berlin had transformed into the cabaret capital of the world. The city was a neon-lit playground of jazz, modern art, and cinema. But while the elite drank champagne on the Kurfürstendamm, the scars of the war were hidden, not healed. Men like Carl Schmitt found work in the new factories, but they watched with suspicion as traditional German values were replaced by what they saw as American decadence. October 24th, 1929, 10 o'clock in the morning. In New York City, the opening bell of the stock exchange rang. Within minutes, the world changed. The Black Thursday crash wiped out billions of dollars. The American banks, panicked and bleeding, did the only thing they could. They called in their loans from Germany. The lifeblood of the German recovery was sucked out of the country in a matter of days. March 27th, 1930, 11 o'clock in the morning. The German Grand Coalition government collapsed. The moderate politicians could not agree on how to handle the rising unemployment caused by the American crash. This was the moment democracy in Germany began to fail. Without a functioning government, the power shifted to the aging President von Hindenburg and his circle of conservative generals. The hunger for a savior, July 31st, 1932, 6 o'clock in the evening. The election results were posted on the walls of the Reichstag. The Nazi Party had become the largest political force in Germany, winning 230 seats. 6 million Germans were now unemployed. Carl Schmitt stood in an unemployment line that stretched for 3 city blocks. He was no longer a sergeant. He was a man who couldn't buy milk for his children. January 30th, 1933, 11:30 in the morning. After months of backroom deals and political betrayals, President von Hindenburg reluctantly signed the decree. Adolf Hitler, The man the president had once called a common corporal was now the Chancellor of Germany. The elite thought they could control him. They thought they had hired him to stop the communists. They were tragically, catastrophically wrong. January 30th, 1933, 9 o'clock in the evening. A massive torchlight procession began to march through the Brandenburg Gate. Thousands of SA men in brown shirts carried fire through the darkness, their boots hitting the pavement with a rhythmic, hypnotic thud. Carl Schmidt watched from the sidewalk. He saw the fire in their eyes and felt a mixture of hope and terror. The intermission was fading. The shadows were growing longer. February 27th, 1933, 9:14 in the evening. A fire alarm rang out across central Berlin. The Reichstag building was in flames. Within hours, Hitler used the fire as an excuse to arrest his political opponents and suspend all civil liberties. He claimed the fire was a communist signal for a revolution. Whether the Nazis set the fire themselves or simply exploited it, the result was the same. The law was dead. March 23rd, 1933, 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The Kroll Opera House, which served as the temporary parliament, was surrounded by armed SS guards. Inside, the Enabling Act was passed. This law gave Hitler the power to create any law he wanted without the consent of Parliament. In less than 2 months, the Bohemian corporal had become a legal dictator. The night of the Long Knives, June 30th, 1934, 2 o'clock in the morning. A fleet of black Mercedes. Benz limousines sped along the quiet moonlit road toward Bad Wiessee, a resort town in Bavaria. Inside one of the vehicles sat Adolf Hitler. He was not hunting his political enemies this time. He was hunting his own. For months, the tension between the regular German army and the 3-million-man paramilitary force known as the SA had been reaching a breaking point. The leader of the SA, Ernst Röhm, wanted a second revolution. He wanted to replace the traditional military with his own street fighters. June 30th, 1934, 6:30 in the morning. Hitler burst into Röhm's hotel room with a pistol in his hand. This was the start of the purge that history would remember as the Night of the Long Knives. Across Germany, the SS Hitler's elite black-shirted bodyguard began systematic executions. They didn't just target Röhm. They settled old scores with anyone who had ever crossed the Nazi Party. July 2nd, 1934, 9 o'clock in the morning. The killing finally stopped. Hundreds were dead, including former Chancellor Kurt von Schleicher, who was gunned down in his own home. By murdering his own followers, Hitler had made a deal with the German army. The generals were relieved that the SA threat was gone, and in exchange, they stood by as Hitler became the absolute master of the state. August 2nd, 1934, 9 o'clock in the morning. President von Hindenburg died at the age of 86. Within 3 hours, Hitler announced that the office of president was abolished. He was now the Führer and Reich Chancellor. He forced every soldier in the German army to swear a personal oath of loyalty, not to the Constitution, not to the country, but to him personally. Carl Schmidt, standing in a military barracks, raised his right hand and repeated the words. He was no longer a soldier of Germany. He was a soldier of Adolf Hitler. The sun rises in blood. September 18th, 1931, 10:20 in the evening. Near the city of Mukden in Manchuria, a muffled explosion tore through a section of the South Manchuria Railway. It was a minor blast, barely damaging the tracks, but its echoes would be heard for 14 years. This was the Mukden incident. To the world, it was presented as a Chinese act of sabotage. In reality, it was a false flag operation carefully staged by officers of the Japanese Imperial Army. They needed a reason to invade, and they had just manufactured one. September 19th, 1931, 6:15 in the morning. Japanese forces began seizing key cities across Manchuria without the permission of their own civilian government in Tokyo. The international order was about to be put to its first true test of fire. China appealed to the League of Nations, believing that the New World Order established in 1919 would protect them. February 24th, 1933, 11:45 in the morning. In a drafty hall in Geneva, Switzerland, The League of Nations officially voted to condemn Japan for its aggression. The Japanese delegate, Yosuke Matsuoka, stood up. He did not apologize. He told the assembly that the Western powers had no right to lecture Japan on imperialism. He then led his entire delegation out of the room. Japan had called the world's bluff. The League did nothing. No sanctions were imposed and no troops were sent. The lesson reached Berlin and Rome loud and clear. If you are strong enough to take it, the world will eventually look the other way. The Italian Dream of Empire, October 3rd, 1935, 5 o'clock in the morning. The border between Eritrea and Abyssinia, modern-day Ethiopia. Benito Mussolini, the Deuce of Italy, wanted to prove that Italy was once again a great power. He ordered a massive invasion of one of the last independent nations in Africa. He didn't just want land, he wanted a new Roman Empire to distract his people from the economic struggles at home. May 5th, 1936. 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Italian troops marched into the Ethiopian capital, Addis Ababa. The victory was total, but it was achieved through horrific means. The Italian Air Force had used mustard gas against Ethiopian tribesmen, men, women, and children who had nothing but spears and old muskets to defend themselves. June 30th, 1936. 11:20 in the morning, Haile Selassie, the exiled emperor of Ethiopia, stood before the League of Nations in Geneva. He was a small, dignified man in a dark cloak. As he spoke, Italian journalists in the gallery hissed and booed him. "It is us today," he warned the silent diplomats. "It will be you tomorrow." He described the skin of his people peeling off from chemical weapons. The League imposed weak economic sanctions, but they pointedly refused to stop the flow of oil to Mussolini's warships. The peace of the world was being sold for a few barrels of petroleum. The Great Rehearsal, the Spanish Civil War, July 17th, 1936. 5 o'clock in the morning. In Spanish Morocco, a group of nationalist military officers led by General Francisco Franco rose in rebellion against the democratically elected Spanish Republic. Within days, Spain was engulfed in a fratricidal war that would become the dress rehearsal for the global slaughter to come. It was a war of ideologies, fascism against communism, tradition against revolution. August 28th, 1936, 3:30 in the afternoon. Hitler saw an opportunity. He ordered the creation of the Condor Legion, a secret unit of the Luftwaffe. He wasn't just helping Franco, he was using Spain as a laboratory. He wanted to see how his new Heinkel bombers and Messerschmitt fighters performed in real combat. He wanted to train a new generation of pilots in the art of modern war. April 26th, 1937, 4:40 in the afternoon. The town of Guernica, a peaceful Basque market center, was obliterated. For 3 hours, German and Italian planes used the town as target practice, dropping incendiary bombs on civilians fleeing the wreckage. It was the first time in history that saturation bombing was used to terrorize a civilian population. The world was horrified, but the dictators were encouraged. They now knew that the civilian had disappeared from the rules of war. December 13th, 1937, 9 o'clock in the morning. In the city of Nanking, the Chinese capital, the Japanese three alls policy, kill all, loot all, burn all, began in earnest. Over the next 6 weeks, more than 300,000 civilians would be slaughtered in an orgy of violence. The Western powers, Britain, France, and the United States, watched through their telescopes, horrified but paralyzed. The road to 1939 was being paved with the bodies of millions in the East. The annexation of souls, the fall of Austria, February 12th. 1938, 11 o'clock in the morning. The air at Hitler's mountain retreat, the Berghof, was thin and cold. Inside, the Austrian Chancellor, Kurt von Schuschnigg, felt as though he were being suffocated. For hours, Hitler screamed at him, pacing back and forth in his vast study. Hitler didn't want a treaty, he wanted to surrender. He demanded that Austria lift the ban on the Nazi Party and appoint Nazis to key cabinet positions. "I am the greatest German who has ever lived," Hitler shouted, his voice echoing off the Alpine stone. I will achieve the unification of the German people with or without you. March 9th, 1938. 6 o'clock in the evening. Back in Vienna, Schuschnigg made a desperate, final gamble. He announced a national referendum. He wanted the Austrian people to vote on whether they wished to remain an independent Christian and German state. He believed that the majority would say yes to independence. But Hitler could not risk a fair vote. He knew that a no from the Austrian people would destroy his momentum. March 11th, 1938, 8:45 in the evening. The ultimatum arrived in Vienna. Schuschnigg was told to cancel the referendum and resign or face an immediate invasion. He looked to Britain and France for help, but the phone lines remained silent. At midnight, he went on the radio. His voice was trembling. "We are yielding to force," he told his people. "God protect Austria." March 12th, 1938, 5:30 in the morning. The border gates were lifted. 8 divisions of the German Wehrmacht rolled across the frontier. There was no resistance. Instead, there were flowers. In the city of Linz, crowds lined the streets, weeping with joy and throwing petals at the tanks. To many Austrians, this wasn't an invasion, it was a homecoming. But in the shadow of the celebrations, the Gestapo was already at work. March 13th, 1938, 7 o'clock in the evening, Hitler stood on the balcony of the city hall in Vienna. 200,000 people filled the Heldenplatz, a sea of swastikas and cheering faces. He announced the Anschluss, the total political union of Austria and Germany. While the world watched the footage of the cheering crowds, they didn't see what was happening in the back alleys. Jewish citizens were being forced to scrub the pro-independence slogans off the sidewalks with their bare hands while onlookers jeered. The intermission was moving into its final, most violent phase. The Munich betrayal, the death of Czechoslovakia, May 20th, 1938, 9 o'clock in the morning. The focus of the world shifted northwest to the Sudetenland, the mountainous border region of Czechoslovakia. 3 million ethnic Germans lived there, and Hitler was using their mistreatment as a pretext for his next move. But Czechoslovakia was not Austria. It was a thriving democracy with a powerful army and a massive chain of mountain fortifications. More importantly, it had a formal military alliance with France and the Soviet Union. September 12, 1938, 8:15 in the evening. At the Nuremberg rally, Hitler delivered a speech of such ferocity that it felt like a declaration of war. He called the Czech president, Edvard Benega, a liar and a criminal. He demanded the immediate return of the Sudetenland to Germany. Across Europe, people began to dig trenches in city parks and fit gas masks to their children. The nightmare of 1914 was returning. September 15th, 1938, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain did something no leader had ever done. At the age of 69, he boarded a plane for the first time in his life and flew to Germany to meet Hitler. He believed that if he could just sit down with the man, he could find a reasonable solution. He didn't understand that he wasn't dealing with a politician, but with a predator. September 29th, 1938, 12:45 p.m., the Munich conference began. 4 men sat in the Führerbau: Hitler, Mussolini, Chamberlain, and Daladier of France. The Soviet Union, Czechoslovakia's ally, was not invited. Czechoslovakia itself was barred from the room. Its representatives were forced to wait in a nearby hotel like prisoners awaiting a verdict. September 30th, 1938, 2 o'clock in the morning, the deal was signed. France and Britain agreed to give Hitler everything he asked for. The Sudetenland would be handed to Germany within 10 days. In exchange, Hitler signed a piece of paper promising he had no more territorial ambitions in Europe. September 30th, 1938, 11:10 in the morning, Chamberlain landed back in London. He stood on the tarmac of Heston Aerodrome, waving the piece of paper. "I believe it is peace for our time," he told the ecstatic, weeping crowds. He believed he had saved a generation from the trenches. In reality, he had merely ensured that when the war came, the Western Allies would be weaker and the enemy would be stronger. The final mask falls March 15th, 1939, 6 o'clock in the morning. The peace for our time lasted exactly 166 days. Hitler ignored the Munich Agreement and ordered his troops into the rest of Czechoslovakia. German tanks rattled through the streets of Prague. The mask of ethnic unification was gone. Hitler was now seizing land inhabited by people who were not German. He was building an empire by conquest. March 15th, 1939, 9 o'clock in the evening. Hitler stood in Prague Castle, looking out over the city. He felt a sense of supreme triumph. He had dismantled the strongest democracy in Central Europe without firing a single shot. He had outmaneuvered the old men of London and Paris. March 31st, 1939, 3:30 in the afternoon, Neville Chamberlain finally woke up to the reality of the threat. He stood before the House of Commons and announced a formal guarantee to Poland. Britain and France promised that if Hitler attacked the Poles, they would declare war. The line in the sand had finally been drawn, but the sand was shifting. August 23rd, 1939, 11:30 at night. In the Kremlin in Moscow, a scene occurred that shocked the world to its core. The Nazi foreign minister, Joachim von Ribbentrop, and the Soviet foreign minister, Vyacheslav Molotov, signed a non-aggression pact. Hitler and Stalin. The two men who had spent a decade calling each other monsters were now partners. Secretly, the pact included a protocol to divide Poland between them. For Hitler, this was the final piece of the puzzle. He no longer had to fear a war on two fronts. He could crush Poland, and Stalin would help him. August 31st, 1939, 8 o'clock in the evening. SS operatives, dressed in Polish uniforms, staged a fake attack on a German radio station at Gleiwitz. They left behind the body of a local farmer, murdered by lethal injection and dressed as a soldier, as proof of Polish aggression. It was a crude, clumsy lie, but it was all Hitler needed. September 1st, 1939, 4:45 in the morning. The battleship Schleswig-Holstein opened fire on the Polish depot at Westerplatte. The 20-year intermission was over. The long, dark road had reached its end. The thunder of September, the invasion of Poland, September 1st, 1939. 4:45 in the morning. The world as it had been known for 20 years ceased to exist. In the gray, misty light of dawn, the German battleship Schleswig-Holstein, which had been on a friendly visit to the free city of Danzig, unleashed its massive 11-inch guns. The target was Westerplatte, a small Polish military transit depot. This was the opening salvo of the most destructive conflict in human history. September 1st, 1939, 6 o'clock in the morning. Across the border, 1.5 million German troops surged into Poland. This was the debut of Blitzkrieg, lightning war. It was not just an invasion, it was a revolution in military science. For centuries, wars had been fought at the speed of a marching soldier. Now, they were fought at the speed of the internal combustion engine. Massive formations of panzer tanks, supported by motorized infantry, punched deep holes in the Polish lines. They didn't stop to fight small battles, they simply bypassed them, racing toward the rear to cut off communication and supplies. Above them, the Luftwaffe held absolute command of the skies. The Stuka dive bombers, equipped with Jericho trumpet sirens, screamed down from the clouds, shattering the morale of both soldiers and civilians. September 3rd, 1939, 11 o'clock in the morning. In London, the atmosphere was one of grim resignation. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain sat before a microphone at 10 Downing Street. His voice was cracked with the weight of failure. He announced that because Germany had not responded to the British ultimatum to withdraw from Poland, a state of war now existed between the two nations. September 3rd, 1939, 5 o'clock in the afternoon. France followed suit. The two great Western democracies were officially at war with Germany. But while the declarations were loud, the actions were silent. Along the French border, the massive French army sat behind the concrete walls of the Maginot Line. They did not attack. They did not move to help their Polish allies. This began the period known as the Phony War, a surreal time when the Western powers waited for a blow that they were too afraid to strike themselves. The Soviet entry, September 17, 1939. 3 o'clock in the morning. Just as the Polish army was attempting to reorganize its defenses on the Vistula River, they received a message that felt like a death sentence. The Soviet Red Army was crossing the eastern border. Stalin was moving to collect his share of the spoils promised in the Nazi-Soviet pact. September 17, 1939, 10 o'clock in the morning. caught between the most powerful land army in Western Europe and the massive weight of the Soviet Union in the east, the Polish state began to disintegrate. The government fled toward the Romanian border. In the city of Brest-Litovsk, German and Soviet officers, men who had been taught to hate each other for a decade, shook hands and held the joint victory parade. The map of Eastern Europe was being redrawn in blood and ink. September 27th, 1939, 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Warsaw, the capital of Poland, finally surrendered after weeks of brutal siege and relentless aerial bombardment. The city was a smoking ruin. The conquest was complete, and the darkness of occupation began. For the Polish people, the nightmare of the Holocaust and the suppression of their culture had started. The Winter of Silence, the Phony War, November 30th, 1939, 8 o'clock in the morning. While Western Europe remained strangely quiet, the war exploded in the north. Joseph Stalin, emboldened by his success in Poland, launched an invasion of Finland. He expected a swift victory, but he underestimated the ferocity of the Finnish resistance. December 15th, 1939, 9 o'clock in the morning, the Winter War became a symbol of David against Goliath. In the sub-zero forests of the Arctic Circle, Finnish snipers on skis known as the White Death decimated entire Soviet divisions. Though Finland would eventually be forced to cede territory in March 1940, the conflict revealed deep weaknesses in the Soviet military. In Berlin, Adolf Hitler watched the Soviet failures with a cold, calculating eye. He began to believe that the Red Army was a giant with feet of clay. January 10th, 1940, 11:30 in the morning, a German courier plane carrying the top-secret plans for the invasion of France in the Low Countries lost its way in the fog and crash-landed in Belgium. The plans were captured by the Belgian authorities and shared with the French and British. Hitler was furious, but the accident forced his generals to come up with a new, even more daring plan. February 18th, 1940, 3:30 in the afternoon, General Erich von Manstein presented this new plan to Hitler. Instead of attacking through central Belgium as the Allies expected, the German panzers would strike through the Ardennes forest, a region of thick woods and narrow roads that the French believed was impenetrable to tanks. It was a massive gamble. If it worked, the Allied armies would be cut off and trapped. The end of the Intermission, the fall of the West, April 9th, 1940, 4:15 in the morning. The Phony War ended with a sudden violent stroke. German troops invaded Denmark and Norway simultaneously. Denmark fell in less than 6 hours. Norway, aided by British and French troops, held out for weeks, but the superior German air power and coordination eventually secured the fjords. The British government was in turmoil. The failure in Norway led to the downfall of Neville Chamberlain. May 10th, 1940, 7:30 in the morning. Winston Churchill was summoned to Buckingham Palace. He was appointed Prime Minister of Great Britain. On that same morning, the German hammer finally fell on the West. May 10th, 1940, 5:30 in the morning. German paratroopers dropped onto the impregnable Belgian fortress of Eben-Emael, capturing it in minutes. Simultaneously, the main panzer force began its crawl through the Ardennes forest. May 14th, 1940, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The German panzers emerged from the woods at Sedan and crossed the Meuse River. The French defenses collapsed. The Maginot mentality, the belief that they could win a defensive war behind walls, was shattered. The German tanks raced toward the English Channel, covering 60 miles a day. May 20th. 1940, 9 o'clock in the evening. The German 2nd Panzer Division reached the coast at Abbeville. In just 10 days, the British and French armies had been split in two. The British Expeditionary Force was backed against the sea at a small port called Dunkirk. The 20-year intermission had not just ended. It had resulted in the total collapse of the European order. June 4th, 1940, 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The last ships left the beaches of Dunkirk. Against all odds, over 330,000 Allied soldiers were rescued by a fleet of destroyers and little ships, civilian fishing boats and yachts. But they left everything behind: their tanks, their guns, and their pride. June 22nd, 1940. 3:12 in the afternoon. In a final act of calculated humiliation, Adolf Hitler forced the French delegates to sign their surrender in the exact same railway carriage in the forest of Compiègne where Germany had surrendered in 1918. He sat in the same chair that Marshal Foch had used. The circle was complete. The revenge was absolute. But as Hitler danced a small jig of triumph, he did not look across the English Channel where Winston Churchill was preparing his people for their finest hour. The long, dark road had led to the edge of the abyss, and the world was about to fall in. The battle for the skies, the Battle of Britain, July 10th. 1940. 9 o'clock in the morning. The first phase of what would become the most significant aerial campaign in history began over the English Channel. The Luftwaffe, the most powerful air force in the world, started attacking British coastal convoys. This was the Kanalkampf. Hitler's goal was simple: to clear the skies of the Royal Air Force so that his invasion fleet, Operation Sea Lion, could cross the water. August 13th, 1940, 5:30 in the morning. This was Adlertag, Eagle Day. The Luftwaffe launched a massive offensive against British airfields and radar stations. For the young pilots of the RAF, many of them barely out of their teens, it was a fight for survival. They were outnumbered, but they had two secret weapons: the superior maneuverability of the Supermarine Spitfire and a revolutionary network of radio towers known as radar. September 7th, 1940. 5 o'clock in the evening. Hitler made a fatal strategic error. Frustrated by the resilience of the RAF, he ordered the Luftwaffe to stop attacking military airfields and start bombing London. This began the Blitz. Over 300 bombers filled the sky over the Thames, turning the docks of East London into a furnace. While this brought horrific suffering to civilians, it gave the RAF the breathing room they needed to rebuild their bases and repair their planes. September 15th, 1940. 11 o'clock in the morning. This was the climax of the battle. The Luftwaffe launched a massive, all-out daylight raid on London. The sky was a chaotic tapestry of contrails and fire. By the end of the day, it was clear that the RAF had held the line. Hitler was forced to postpone Operation Sea Lion indefinitely. For the first time, the Nazi war machine had been stopped. As Winston Churchill famously said, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." The Arsenal of Democracy, The American Awakening, September 3rd, 1940, 2 o'clock in the afternoon. In Washington, D.C., President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed the Destroyers for Bases Agreement. The United States was officially neutral, but the intermission of isolationism was ending. Roosevelt knew that if Britain fell, the United States would be alone. He began a delicate political dance to bypass the Neutrality Acts and provide Britain with the tools to stay in the fight. December 29th, 1940, 9 o'clock in the evening. Roosevelt delivered one of his most famous fireside chats over the radio. He told the American people that they could no longer hide behind two oceans. "We must be the great arsenal of democracy," he declared. He wasn't promising American blood yet, but he was promising American steel, oil, and gunpowder. March 11th, 1941, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the Lend-Lease Act was signed into law. This was effectively a declaration of economic war against the Axis powers. The United States began shipping billions of dollars worth of supplies to Britain and, later, to the Soviet Union. The sleeping giant was waking up, and its industrial might was about to dwarf anything the world had ever seen. The Global Flashpoint. Crisis in the Pacific, September 27th. 1940. 1 o'clock in the afternoon. In Berlin, the representatives of Germany, Italy, and Japan signed the Tripartite Pact. This officially created the Axis. It was a mutual defense treaty designed to warn the United States to stay out of both the war in Europe and the war in China. In reality, it only deepened the resolve of the American government to stop Japanese expansion. July 26th, 1941, 8 o'clock in the morning. In response to Japan's occupation of French Indochina, President Roosevelt ordered the freezing of all Japanese assets in the United States and imposed a total oil embargo. This was a death blow to the Japanese economy. Without American oil, the Japanese Navy would be paralyzed within months. October 17th, 1941, 10 o'clock in the morning, General Hideki Tojo became the Prime Minister of Japan. He was a hardline militarist who believed that war with the United States was inevitable. The Japanese government faced a choice: withdraw from China and lose face, or strike the American fleet at anchor and seize the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies. Final midnight, the end of the beginning. December 6th, 1941, 9 o'clock in the evening. In Washington, D.C., American intelligence intercepted a long 14-part message from Tokyo to the Japanese embassy. It was clear that diplomatic relations were about to be severed, but the message didn't say where or when the strike would happen. The eyes of the world were on the Philippines and Thailand. No one was looking at Hawaii. December 7th, 1941, 7:55 in the morning. The 20-year intermission didn't just end, it exploded. The first wave of Japanese planes appeared over Pearl Harbor. As the battleships of the Pacific Fleet were torn apart by torpedoes and bombs, the last illusions of the 19th century died. December 8th, 1941, 12:30 p.m. President Roosevelt stood before a joint session of Congress. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. By the end of the day, the United States was at war with Japan. 3 days later, Hitler and Mussolini declared war on the United States. The two separate wars, one in the East and one in the West, had finally merged into a single, global conflagration. The road that had started in the mud of the Western Front in 1918 and wound through the streets of Berlin, the mountains of Ethiopia, and the cities of China had finally reached its destination. The world was now fully engulfed in the greatest catastrophe human civilization had ever known. January 1st, 1942, 10 o'clock in the morning, 26 nations signed a declaration by United Nations, pledging to use all their resources to defeat the Axis. The intermission was long gone. The tragedy was in full swing, and the struggle for the soul of humanity would continue for 3 more bloody, desperate years. The lesson of the shadows: history is not a ghost story told to frighten children. It is a mirror. The 20 years between the 2 world wars prove that peace is not merely the absence of war. It is a fragile structure that requires constant care, courage, and a commitment to justice over vengeance. The men who signed the Treaty of Versailles thought they were ending a war. Instead, they were planting the seeds for a harvest of fire. The people who traded their freedom for order in 1933 found that they had bought a ticket to their own destruction. And the leaders who chose silence in the face of aggression learned that a fire ignored is a fire that eventually consumes everything. As we look back at the ticking clocks of the 1920s and 30s, we must ask ourselves, are we listening to the silence of our own time? Because history is always waiting for the intermission to end.